Imagine stepping through these heavy velvet-lined doors of a massive echoing concert hall.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. And inside, there is a sprawling symphony orchestra, and they are mid-performance, playing this complex, thunderous movement at absolute full volume.
A literal wall of sound.
Exactly. The sheer acoustic force just hits you right in the chest. Now, suppose your objective for this deep dive is to record this performance, to actually analyze the individual musician's techniques.
That sounds nearly impossible with the basic setup.
It is. Standard clinical electroencephalography, or conventional EEG, is essentially the equivalent of standing at the very back of that vast room.
Armed with what? Just a single microphone?
Yeah, a single rudimentary omnidirectional microphone, and you're attempting to capture the whole thing.
Right, you'd get the overall tempo, certainly.
You can tell if the music is generally fast or slow. You will definitely register the catastrophic crash of a cymbal.
Like a seizure in the brain.
Exactly. But when it comes to the intricate bowing technique of the second violins, or the subtle embouchure of the oboe player,
the recording is just a blurry, muddy amalgamation of noise.
the spatial resolution is practically non-existent.
That really captures the historical limitation perfectly. You are capturing the macro state of the cerebral cortex.
But missing the details.
Missing all of them. In doing so, you are entirely losing the microscopic contributions of individual neuronal populations.
So it's just a general impression.
Precisely. The standard EEG provides a highly generalized impression of cortical arousal. It tells you if the patient is awake or asleep, or perhaps having a gross electrical storm like that cymbal crash you mentioned.
The tonic-clonic seizure.
Right. But as a tool for mapping the nuanced architecture of psychiatric illness, it falls drastically short.
And that limitation is the real launch pad for our discussion today, because we are looking at quantitative electroencephalography, or qEEG.
Which changes the game entirely.
It really does.
Yeah.
Imagine taking that ambient, blurry concert hall recording and feeding it into a state-of-the-art digital mixing board.
Powered by some serious computational algorithms.
Exactly. Suddenly you apply these mathematical filters, you isolate the string section from the brass.
You quantify the exact decibel level of the percussion down to the microsecond.
Right. You analyze the harmonic resonance of the cellos, and then, and this is the crazy part, you mathematically compare this specific performance against a database of thousands of other flawless performances.
So you can pinpoint exactly which violinist in the third row is a quarter tone flat.
That is the essence of qEEG, that computational isolation.
It represents a monumental paradigm shift in neurophysiology. I mean, throughout the history of medicine, we have always craved direct visibility.
Like seeing a broken bone.
Exactly. You want to see the fracture on the X-ray or the tumor on the MRI. We rely on clear structural categorizations.
But the brain isn't just structure.
No, the brain's pathology is frequently not structural at all. It is functional, it's dynamic, and it's heavily rhythmic.
So for decades, psychiatrists were just stuck at the back of the room,
staring at blurry analog recordings. But today's exploration is about the transition from visually observing a chaotic voltage wave to mathematically computing its underlying architecture.
And our mission for this deep dive is to explore exactly how qEEG transforms those chaotic electrical squiggles into measurable, mathematically interpretable patterns.
Moving from observing to decoding.
Decoding the dynamic, millisecond by millisecond language of widespread neural networks.
Which is vital for any clinician listening today.
Absolutely. For the psychiatry trainee, the registrar, or the clinician listening to this, we have to anchor this entire conceptual journey in a single defining truth.
And what is that anchor?
Psychiatry is the study of how brain, mind, and experience interact and how that process can go wrong.
That is perfectly stated. And looking back at the historical arc gives us crucial context here. You have to consider Hans Berger.
The German psychiatrist, right?
Yes, he first recorded the human EEG way back in 1928, and his explicit objective was not to diagnose epilepsy.
Wait, really? I always thought EEG started with neurology.
Most people do. But Berger's fundamental dream was that measuring the brain's electrical currents would revolutionize psychiatry.
He wanted to see the mind at work.
Exactly. He believed he had discovered the window into the biological basis of schizophrenia, melancholia, and cognitive functioning.
But history tells us that his psychiatric colleagues were largely dismissive.
Quite dismissive. And the revolution he wanted was delayed by nearly half a century.
Why the massive delay?
Well, the psychiatric insights Berger hoped for simply were not accessible to the naked eye.
Because they were just looking at ink on paper?
Right, raw analog EEG tracings, just ink pens scratching across continuously scrolling paper.
And our brains just can't process that.
No, the human visual system is completely incapable of discerning complex, multivariable statistical patterns embedded within all that noise.
So it just got handed over to the neurologists.
For over 50 years, the primary clinical application was relegated strictly to neurology. Generations of electroencephalographers spent their careers visually scanning miles of paper.
Looking for obvious wave shapes.
Yes, like spike and wave discharges, specifically for detecting seizure disorders or gross structural lesions.
So the turning point, according to our sources, required a massive technological intervention.
The digital revolution of the 1970s.
Right. It didn't just replace paper with computer screens. It introduced the ability to apply mathematical algorithms to the voltage data.
Most notably, the fast Fourier transform.
The FFT. Let's unpack that, because it's essentially the mathematical engine of qEEG, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It allows us to take a complex, squiggly wave and break it down into its constituent sine waves.
So instead of just looking at a fluctuating line hell.
The FFT computes the power spectrum. It mathematically analyzes the oscillations from each specific region of the scalp.
Quantifying the exact distribution of electrical power.
Exactly, as a function of frequency. We finally moved from visual pattern recognition to objective numerical quantification.
Which brings us to the core conceptual framework of data acquisition. Because the sophisticated math of the FFT is utterly useless if the raw data feeding into it is inconsistent.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. The text points to the International 1020 electrode placement system as the bedrock of all this. It was adopted back in 1938.
A remarkably enduring standard.
But frankly, when you first read about it, the system sounds a bit arbitrary.
How so?
Well, it uses a proportional percentage system, placing electrodes at intervals of 10% or 20% of the total distance across the skull.
Right.
Why rely on relative percentages? If we're trying to target a specific cortical structure, wouldn't a rigid measurement, say, exactly 5 centimeters from the bridge of the nose, be vastly more accurate?
I see your point, and it seems counterintuitive at first. But you have to account for the extreme biological variability of the human cranial vault.
Skulls come in all shapes and sizes.
Drastically different sizes, not just in overall volume, but in their front to back versus side-to-side ratios.
Oh, I see.
If you were to use a fixed metric measurement, placing an electrode exactly 5 centimeters superior to the nasion, well, that electrode might rest perfectly over the prefrontal cortex in a toddler.
But in a large adult,
It might barely clear the frontal sinuses.
that would ruin any attempt at standardization across different patients.
Completely. The genius of the 1020 system is that it treats the human head as a geometric ellipsoid.
Okay, so it scales based on landmarks.
Exactly. It defines its grid based on invariable anatomical landmarks. The nasion at the bridge of the nose, the inion at the occipital protuberance at the back, and the preauricular points right in front of the ears.
So by placing the electrodes at distances proportional to the overall circumference,
The system scales automatically for every single patient.
and we know for sure it's accurate.
Yes, extensive neuroanatomical and postmortem studies have confirmed it. This proportional mapping ensures a specific electrode will sit precisely over the corresponding Brodmann cytoarchitectural area.
Independent of the head size.
Completely independent.
So an F3 electrode placement is always going to target the left middle frontal gyrus.
Whether the patient is a 5-year-old child or an 80-year-old adult.
That geographical certainty really is the foundation of reliable data collection. Because if the data feed is compromised by inconsistent placement, the mathematical analysis later is just flawed.
Fundamentally flawed.
Okay, so once we have that reliable topographic data feed, the FFT breaks the signal down into the classic wide frequency bands.
The Greek alphabet we all remember from medical school.
Right. We have delta operating between 1.5 and 3.5 hertz, theta from 3.5 to 7.5 hertz, alpha spanning 7.5 to 12.5 hertz,
And then the faster ones.
beta from 12.5 to 25 hertz, and gamma firing up at 30 to 50 hertz.
A very standard breakdown.
But here's a common misconception, one I actually shared for a long time. I thought these frequency cutoffs were just arbitrary slices.
Like they just chose round numbers to make the charts look tidy.
Exactly.
Well, the initial delineations were indeed somewhat arbitrary, based entirely on visual observation by those early electroencephalographers.
They just eyeballed it.
Pretty much. They noticed the prominent 10 hertz rhythm when a subject closed their eyes and named it alpha, then labeled the slower waves delta and theta.
But it turns out they were right.
They were. And the validation of these distinct bands is actually one of the major triumphs of qEEG.
How did they validate it?
When we later applied sophisticated statistical techniques, specifically computerized principal component analyses, or PCA, to vast data sets of digitized EEG, the math literally proved the biology.
Let's delve into that PCA aspect for a second. We are talking about taking massive amounts of overlapping variance in the electrical data and finding the independent variables that explain it.
Exactly. The PCA demonstrated that these traditional frequency bands are not just linguistic labels.
They aren't just arbitrary markers on a dial.
No, they actually correspond to truly independent sources of variance in human brain activity. They are mathematically distinct channels of operation,
Representing fundamentally different cellular generators within the brain.
Let's consider the neurophysiology behind them. Delta rhythms, the slow, high-amplitude waves of 1.5 to 3.5 hertz, are primarily generated by the hyperpolarization of pyramidal neurons in the cortex.
And normally you only see that in deep sleep.
In a healthy state, prominent delta is indeed the hallmark of deep, slow-wave sleep.
But what if you see it in an awake person?
If you observe excessive delta activity in an awake, alert adult, it is highly indicative of a pathological process.
Like what kind of pathology?
It often signifies functional deferentation, where the cortex has lost its subcortical inputs, or a direct neuropathologic insult, such as severe ischemia or a major white matter lesion.
Wow. And as we move up the frequency spectrum, the physiological origins shift entirely.
They do. Take theta rhythms, operating in the 3.5 to 7.5 hertz range. They are strongly linked to the septohippocampal system and the limbic network.
So memory and emotion.
Yes, critical for memory consolidation and emotional regulation.
And then there's alpha.
Alpha rhythms, the 7.5 to 12.5 hertz band, are generated by complex pacemaker interactions between the thalamic reticular nucleus and the cortex.
Alpha's sort of the famous one, isn't it?
It is the brain's dominant resting rhythm. When you close your eyes and relax, the thalamus orchestrates this massive, synchronized oscillation across the posterior regions of the brain.
It's the brain shifting into neutral.
A highly active, rhythmic neutral, yes. But as you progress to the beta and gamma ranges, you are observing entirely different mechanisms.
The fast oscillations.
Fast oscillations, particularly gamma at 30 to 50 hertz. These arise from the rapid firing of local parvalbumin positive inhibitory interneurons. Yes, they govern corticocortical and thalamocortical transactions. Beta and gamma are the frequencies of active information processing, intense focused attention, and the actual binding of conscious perception.
So understanding that each frequency band is generated by completely different anatomical structures and synaptic mechanisms is vital for this next major conceptual leap.
The ground state.
Exactly, the concept of the ground state and neurometrics. The text describes a phenomenon that completely upends how we usually think about human neurobiology.
It is quite countercultural in psychiatry.
Right, because we are taught that the human brain is the most complex, idiosyncratic structure in the known universe. Our thoughts, our traumas, our personalities are uniquely ours.
Subjectively, yes.
Yet, the research indicates that the baseline electrical activity of a healthy resting brain, when you're just alert but resting in a quiet room with your eyes closed, is governed by a universally rigid, genetically based homeostatic system.
The implications of this homeostatic ground state are profound, particularly for objective psychiatric diagnostics.
I really have to play the skeptic here for a minute.
Please do.
We know about neuroplasticity. We know that chronic stress, cultural upbringing, environmental enrichment, lifelong learning, all of that physically wires the brain differently.
Undeniably.
So how can we possibly assert that the fundamental resting electrical matrix of my brain is statistically indistinguishable from a healthy individual of my exact age, living in an entirely different hemisphere, raised in an entirely different culture?
Your skepticism is warranted, but it highlights a crucial distinction between the content of thought and the biological machinery that enables it.
Okay, break that down for me.
Neuroplasticity certainly alters synaptic weights and specific local circuits to store your unique memories and your cultural adaptations.
Right.
However, the overarching homeostatic regulation of the brain's macroelectrical rhythms, the ground state, is evolutionarily conserved and heavily genetically determined.
So it's the difference between the software running the specific programs and the underlying operating system that manages the hardware's power supply.
That is a perfect analogy. The comprehensive, cross-cultural research into this ground state is robust. Scientists have established massive normative databases spanning from early childhood up to 90 years of age.
And these hold up across different populations.
repeatedly and independently replicated across multiple countries and diverse populations. They are astonishingly stable, highly replicable, and completely independent of cultural, ethnic, or racial factors.
That just blows my mind.
The brain's idling engine operates to the exact same mathematical specifications regardless of the environment.
And that universal baseline is what allows for the mathematical transformation of the data.
Precisely.
Because we have a known, predictable biological norm, we can apply Gaussian statistics. We convert the raw individual EEG features into z-scores.
A z-score, in this context, is a transformation that places the patient's specific neuroelectrical data onto a standardized curve.
Right, Statistics 101.
It represents the number of standard deviations a patient's measurement falls away from the expected norm for their exact age.
The age regression aspect is critical there, isn't it?
Crucial.
Because the ground state of a 6-year-old is vastly different from the ground state of a 60-year-old.
Yes, due to normal developmental processes like synaptic pruning and myelination, the normative database accounts for this developmental trajectory.
It adjusts the expectation based on age.
By applying age regression equations, we establish what the precise parameters should be for a person at that specific stage of life.
So it's highly individualized in that sense.
If we return to your earlier point about standardization, the z-score provides a highly reliable, objective metric. It is functionally identical to the diagnostic logic used in an electrocardiogram.
An ECG.
Yes. An ECG has a universally known, predictable morphological pattern. If the ST segment elevates or the PR interval elongates, that deviation from the baseline is immediately indicative of a pathophysiologic process.
Regardless of whether the patient is an extrovert or an introvert.
Exactly. Their unique personality doesn't change the healthy electrical rhythm of the heart.
So scaling these neurometric features as z-scores removes the individual anatomical noise and leaves us with a pure signal of deviation.
And because everything is converted into a standardized z-score, it permits multivariate analysis.
Meaning, we aren't restricted to looking at one frequency band in one isolated region of the scalp.
We can combine selected univariate z-scores from across the entire cortical surface. We can compute the overall abnormality across a massive set of variables simultaneously.
This allows clinicians to build a comprehensive, multidimensional mathematical profile of a patient's brain function.
We can detect subtle, distributed patterns of dysregulation that would be entirely invisible if we only examined single variables in isolation.
Okay, so if we accept that this universal baseline exists, the subsequent clinical question is, what is the anatomical system driving it? Where is this ground state actually generated?
Current neuroscientific models strongly connect the qEEG ground state to the default mode network, or the DMN.
The famous DMN. It really has revolutionized our understanding of resting brain states.
It has. For a long time, neuroscience operated under the assumption that the brain was essentially quiet until it was given a specific task to perform.
Which we now know is completely false.
Completely. The brain consumes an immense amount of glucose and oxygen precisely when you are doing absolutely nothing.
It is the brain's intrinsic idling engine.
Exactly. The DMN is a highly distributed, interconnected set of cortical and subcortical regions that becomes metabolically highly active when you are not focused on receiving or processing input from the external environment.
So when I'm just staring out the window.
When it dominates, you are engaged in internal mentation daydreaming, autobiographical memory retrieval, or theory of mind exercises.
And the anatomical hubs of this network include the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus, the inferior parietal lobule, and the medial temporal lobes, including the hippocampus.
These regions interact constantly. What is vital for clinicians to grasp is the direct correlation between the qEEG ground state and the functional integrity of this DMN.
They're essentially reflecting the same system.
Because the DMN governs the brain's baseline resting state, deviations from the normative qEEG ground state are fundamentally reflections of DMN dysregulation.
And this network is heavily implicated in psychopathology.
Heavily. Numerous psychiatric and neurological conditions, including ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and Alzheimer's disease.
That actually sets up a fascinating technological challenge for qEEG.
The depth issue.
Yes. If the ground state is a reflection of this deeply embedded default mode network, how do we actually visualize it?
Right, because the electrodes are sitting on the scalp.
They're recording surface voltage, but the DMN hubs like the posterior cingulate and the hippocampus are buried deep within the brain volume.
This leads us to one of the most mathematically intensive aspects of our sources, turning two-dimensional scalp recordings into full three-dimensional tomographic brain maps.
It expands qEEG from just a topographic tool into a truly tomographic functional imaging modality.
But to achieve this, physicists and mathematicians had to confront what is famously known as the inverse problem.
Let's spend some time on this because the inverse problem is a notorious concept in electrophysics.
It is.
According to Helmholtz's theorem, if you have a known electrical source inside a sphere representing the brain inside the skull, you can calculate exactly what the voltage pattern will look like on the surface.
That is the forward problem, and it has a unique, absolute solution.
But the inverse problem is going backwards, taking the surface voltage pattern and trying to deduce the internal source.
Which is incredibly difficult.
Because mathematically, there are an infinite number of internal dipole configurations that could theoretically produce the exact same surface pattern.
That is the absolute crux of the challenge. Because the skull acts as a severe spatial low-pass filter, it smears and diffuses the electrical signal as it travels from the cortex to the scalp.
Like trying to guess the shape of a rock by looking at the ripples on the surface of a pond.
Exactly. So how can we possibly claim millimeter-level accuracy in locating the source?
How do they do it?
The answer lies in the application of low-resolution source localization mathematical models, specifically tools known as VRETA, which stands for Variable Resolution Electromagnetic Tomographic Analysis, and SLRETA.
Standardized low-resolution brain electromagnetic tomography.
Yes.
How do these algorithms circumvent the infinite possibilities of the inverse problem? Because infinite is a big number.
They solve it by introducing heavy, biologically plausible mathematical constraints.
They give the math some rules.
Exactly. They operate on the assumption that adjacent groups of neurons tend to fire together synchronously. Therefore, algorithms like SLRETA seek the smoothest possible 3D distribution of electrical activity that could account for the surface scalp data.
So they eliminate the chaotic, impossible configurations.
Right. They calculate the most probable intracranial sources by restricting the mathematical search space solely to cortical gray matter and the hippocampus.
Ignoring the white matter and ventricles.
Because we know generating dipoles cannot physically exist there.
They force the math to obey the rules of human neuroanatomy. That's brilliant.
And then, once the algorithm calculates those most probable active voxels, it superimposes them onto a standardized probabilistic MRI brain atlas.
This atlas is a composite, right? Constructed from the high-resolution MRI scans of hundreds of healthy individuals.
Yes, it provides a highly accurate generalized spatial template. We project the computed electrical sources directly onto this anatomical map.
Now, for the clinician listening, the immediate question might be, why go through all this complex mathematical gymnastics to estimate brain activity when we already have functional MRI and PT scans?
Which provide direct, high-resolution 3D images.
Exactly. Why not just use fMRI?
That is a critical distinction to make. fMRI and PT do not measure neural activity directly.
They don't.
No. They measure secondary, hemodynamic, or metabolic consequences of neural activity.
Oh, right. The blood flow.
An fMRI tracks the blood oxygen level dependent, or BOLD, signal. When neurons fire, they consume oxygen, and seconds later, vascular changes bring highly oxygenated blood to the area. An fMRI captures that sluggish vascular response.
And PET scan.
A PET scan tracks glucose metabolism over the course of minutes.
So they are inherently delayed, they have great spatial resolution, but terrible temporal resolution.
Precisely. qEEG, on the other hand, is directly measuring the electromagnetic fields generated by the postsynaptic potentials of pyramidal neurons.
In real time.
Its temporal resolution is measured in milliseconds. It allows for the precise identification of neuronal processes exactly as they happen.
Which you need if you want to understand thought.
Furthermore, from a pragmatic clinical perspective, SLRETA averts the need to obtain a highly expensive individual MRI or PET scan for every single patient.
It's much more accessible.
It provides robust functional brain imaging directly at the point of care, without the movement restrictions of a narrow fMRI tube, without the claustrophobia, and without exposing the patient to radioactive isotopes for PET imaging.
That millisecond by millisecond precision brings us to one of the most profound inquiries in our sources. We shift from basic mechanics to discussing what qEEG can reveal about the fundamental mechanism of consciousness itself.
It's a huge philosophical question tackled with empirical data. To understand the biological architecture of consciousness, researchers utilized qEEG to observe the precise moment when consciousness is systematically and reversibly extinguished.
During the administration of general anesthesia,
Yes.
when you monitor a patient on the operating table with qEEG, the transition from wakefulness to the loss of consciousness, or LOC, is not just a gradual dimming of the lights.
It's not a simple fade to black.
The text describes a highly distinctive quantitative shift away from the homeostatic ground state, termed the anesthetic cascade.
The cascade follows a highly predictable sequence, regardless of the specific pharmacological agent used, whether it is propofol, sevoflurane, or dexmedetomidine.
What does the cascade look like?
Initially, as the patient begins to sedate, we observe a marked anteriorization of alpha activity.
Meaning what, exactly?
In a normal waking state, alpha is predominant in the posterior occipital regions. Under anesthesia, this alpha power pushes forcefully forward, dominating the frontal cortex.
Wait, it physically migrates across the cortex.
Yes, the dominant rhythm visibly shifts to the front. Subsequently, the overall power spectrum begins to be dominated by high-amplitude, slow-wave activity, specifically pushing the margins of the delta and theta bands.
The brain is effectively being driven into an artificial state of deep hyperpolarization.
But the most crucial detail, the single most invariant qEEG marker identifying the precise moment of LOC across all studies, is a catastrophic drop in gamma coherence between the prefrontal and posterior brain regions.
Let's dissect the concept of coherence for you listening. We aren't just talking about the sheer power or amplitude of the gamma waves.
No, power is just volume.
Coherence is a mathematical measure of the phase relationship, the synchronization, between two different regions of the brain over time.
Coherence represents functional connectivity. If the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe are firing gamma waves in precise locked synchrony, their coherence is high. They are communicating.
They are working together.
The sharp drop in gamma coherence at the exact moment of LOC indicates that the synchronization between the anterior executive networks and the posterior sensory networks has been completely severed.
This mechanism beautifully addresses the philosophical question of where consciousness resides.
Because it shows it doesn't reside in one place.
Right. The data strongly implies that consciousness is not housed in a localized spot, like a single nucleus or the pineal gland, as Descartes famously suggested.
Rather, consciousness is a dynamic binding process. The posterior regions of the brain are continuously processing incoming sensory data and motor feedback.
And the front.
The anterior regions are managing endogenous emotional states, motivation, and executive planning. For a unified conscious experience to exist, these disparate cortical regions must resonate and be globally coupled through reciprocal thalamocortical loops.
Information in this neurocomputational model is essentially defined as a non-random, highly synchronous deviation from the quiet, resting ground state.
Anesthesia chemically blocks this thalamocortical reverberation. It uncouples the front of the brain from the back, preventing the synchronized binding of sensory input with executive awareness.
The brain is still electrically active.
Highly active, yes, but the fragmented networks can no longer bind their data into a singular conscious frame.
That concept that normal functioning relies entirely on this intricate electrochemical binding and homeostatic regulation provides the perfect bridge to our clinical manifestations.
Because what happens when it breaks down organically?
Exactly. When this delicate synchronization breaks down, not from a controlled dose of propofol, but from the insidious onset of psychiatric illness.
This brings us to a major critical framing concept discussed in the textbook, the chasm between the DSM and objective neurobiology.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, is the absolute cornerstone of psychiatric practice.
Yet it categorizes illnesses almost entirely by subjective symptom clusters and behavioral observation.
It is essentially a syndromal classification system. If a patient exhibits fragmented perception, disorganized speech, and auditory hallucinations, they meet the criteria for a diagnosis of schizophrenia.
But as our sources emphasize, abnormal electrical patterns on a qEEG do not automatically equate to a DSM psychiatric illness.
And conversely, a perfectly normal qEEG does not rule out significant psychopathology.
This is a vital point for clinicians to grasp. If qEEG does not perfectly align with the DSM, what is its utility?
The utility lies in its ability to expose pathophysiologic heterogeneity that the DSM inherently masks. We call this process subtyping, or identifying biotypes.
Imagine you have two patients sitting in your waiting room. Both have been diagnosed with major depressive disorder based on the DSM-5 criteria.
Symptomatically, they appear homogeneous. They both suffer from anhedonia, lethargy, and low mood.
But when you apply qEEG and plot their multivariate variables in a three-dimensional mathematical space, they do not group together.
They form entirely separate clusters.
One patient's depression might be driven by frontal alpha asymmetry, where the left frontal cortex is underactive compared to the right, impairing approach-related behaviors.
And the other patient?
The other patient's depression might be characterized by generalized theta excess, indicating an entirely different neuromodulatory failure.
They share the same syndromal label, but they have fundamentally different diseases occurring at the level of the brain's electrical matrix.
This pathophysiologic heterogeneity explains the most frustrating aspect of modern psychiatry.
Treatment resistance. Why a specific psychotropic medication, like an SSRI, can work absolute miracles for the first patient,
but cause zero improvement or even severe agitation in the second patient with the exact same DSM diagnosis.
Let us ground this concept in specific clinical examples from the textbook, beginning with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
ADHD is perhaps the most heavily researched psychiatric condition in the qEEG literature.
In the context of ADHD, the literature consistently points to the theta-beta ratio, or TBR, as a key metric.
The TBR measures a ratio of slow-wave theta power to fast-wave beta power, typically over the central cortical regions.
For decades, it was investigated as a potential diagnostic tool.
However, we must be scientifically precise here. Massive meta-analyses encompassing thousands of patients have demonstrated that the TBR is not a definitive diagnostic trait when simply compared to healthy controls.
You cannot rely on a high TBR to definitively diagnose ADHD in isolation.
The signal-to-noise ratio overlaps far too much with normal developmental variants.
It fails as a binary diagnostic test, but the textbook emphasizes its immense value as a prognostic biomarker.
A prognostic biomarker predicts the future clinical trajectory. In ADHD, specific baseline qEEG profiles, including variations of the TBR, are incredibly powerful predictors of whether a child will respond favorably to stimulant medication, like methylphenidate,
or to alternative treatments like neurofeedback.
And the subtyping within ADHD is even more revealing. The source material highlights a cluster analysis that fundamentally shatters the idea of ADHD as a single entity.
What did they find?
They found one ADHD cluster characterized primarily by an excess of alpha activity. When they applied source localization algorithms, they found this alpha excess was predominantly cortical, maximizing in the right parietal regions,
which heavily implicates a failure in the brain's posterior attention network, specifically regarding spatial orientation and sustained vigilance.
But another completely distinct cluster of ADHD patients presented with a totally different qEEG profile.
An excess of theta activity.
Yes, and source localization traced this dysfunction not to the cortex, but to temporal, cortical, and hippocampal abnormalities.
We are looking at an under-aroused right parietal cortex in one child and a dysfunctional limbic memory network in another.
Yet under the current standard of care, both receive the identical DSM label of ADHD.
And both are likely prescribed the exact same dose of an amphetamine derivative.
You cannot optimally treat two fundamentally different neurobiological dysfunctions with a blanket protocol.
This is where qEEG paves the way for biologically personalized psychiatry.
We observe this same prognostic power, this ability to see beneath the clinical surface in the assessment of cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease.
The text outlines a well-established qEEG progression as dementia pathology worsens over time.
Initially, we observe an increase in slow-wave activity across the delta and theta bands.
Simultaneously, there is a decreased mean frequency of the total background spectra and an anteriorization of the alpha peak.
Meaning the dominant alpha rhythm shifts away from the posterior occipital regions towards the front of the brain.
While that progression is well documented in moderate to severe dementia, the true clinical breakthrough lies in the sensitivity of qEEG at the earliest preclinical stages of the disease.
The textbook highlights a landmark longitudinal study involving patients presenting with subjective cognitive impairment, or SCI.
We must clarify what SCI entails for the clinicians listening.
Yes, subjective cognitive impairment refers to older adults who visit a memory clinic complaining of noticeable forgetfulness or cognitive slowing.
However, when the neuropsychologist administers standard neurocognitive batteries, the MMSE, the MoCA complex memory recall tasks, the patients perform perfectly normally.
They score within the normative range for their age and education level. By all traditional clinical measures, they are healthy.
Their structural MRI scans may not yet show significant hippocampal atrophy.
The standard clinical protocol is often just watchful waiting. But in this study, researchers recorded the baseline qEEG of these SCI patients and then tracked them longitudinally for 7 years.
The results are astounding. Based solely on that initial baseline qEEG, the researchers could predict with over 90% accuracy which of those seemingly healthy patients would eventually decline and meet the clinical criteria for Alzheimer's disease 7 years later.
The predictive power stems from the fact that functional electrical dysregulation precedes structural decay and overt clinical cognitive failure.
The patients who eventually declined into dementia already harbored significant subclinical qEEG abnormalities at their initial visit.
Specifically, they exhibited excessive theta activity localized to the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the temporoparietal cortex.
To use a mechanistic metaphor, relying on structural MRI or late-stage cognitive testing is like waiting for a bridge to visibly crack and drop concrete before declaring it unsafe.
While qEEG, by measuring the functional electrical strain, the excess theta representing failing cholinergic projections, trying to maintain signaling, detects the microfractures in the foundation years before the structural integrity physically collapses.
It acts as an incredibly sensitive early warning system.
Let's transition to a psychiatric condition characterized not by the structural decay of Alzheimer's, but by a profound failure of functional synchronization: schizophrenia and psychosis.
The qEEG literature regarding psychotic patients reveals remarkably consistent pathophysiological patterns.
The most prominent findings involve a left hemispheric deficiency that leads to an abnormal right hemisphere power dominance.
But the most defining characteristic is severe hypocoherence.
We defined coherence earlier as the mathematical synchronization between different brain regions. Hypocoherence, therefore, is a pathological lack of that synchronization.
We observe this hypocoherence across both short, local neural networks and long, distributed white matter tracts.
If we integrate this finding with our earlier discussion regarding consciousness as a binding process, the clinical implications are profound.
This massive reduction in coherence provides robust biological support for the disconnection hypothesis of schizophrenia.
The illness involves a literal breakdown of the brain's ability to bind information across distributed neural circuits.
The underlying hardware might be intact, but the timing mechanisms, perhaps driven by myelin deficits or failing parvalbumin interneurons, are completely out of phase.
This electrical failure to integrate perception and executive function perfectly mirrors the clinical reality of schizophrenia.
Fragmented thoughts, disorganized speech, and the inability to distinguish internal stimuli from external reality.
Furthermore, subtyping proves just as crucial in psychosis as it is in ADHD. The textbook details a comprehensive cluster analysis involving nearly 400 psychotic patients.
The mathematical sorting did not just separate them into severe versus mild illness.
No, it revealed 6 highly distinct qEEG subtypes.
6 entirely different pathophysiological profiles under the single umbrella of psychosis.
This heterogeneity suggests that these subtypes likely require entirely different pharmacological targets. Upregulating a specific neurotransmitter system might resolve the dysregulation in subtype 1, but completely exacerbate the chaotic firing in subtype 2.
This precise problem introduces the final major section of our discussion: the integration of this electrophysiological data into actual clinical reasoning.
How does a prescribing psychiatrist utilize these mathematical insights to improve patient outcomes?
This ushers in the field of pharmaco-EEG and the qEEG principle.
Pharmaco-EEG studies the specific, predictable ways in which psychotropic compounds alter the brain's electrical ground state. Every class of medication leaves a distinct electrophysiological footprint.
Let me pose a clinical dilemma that is universally frustrating in psychiatry.
Go ahead.
Imagine you are sitting across from a patient suffering from severe, debilitating obsessive-compulsive disorder. You have the prescription pad out. You are considering starting a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, an SSRI.
A very standard first-line treatment.
But you know that SSRIs often take 4 to 6 grueling weeks to show efficacy, assuming they work at all. How do you know if this specific drug will actually help this specific patient before forcing them to endure weeks of potential side effects and trial and error prescribing?
That is the exact clinical gap pharmaco-EEG aims to close. The qEEG principle posits that the patient's baseline pretreatment qEEG profile acts as the lock, and the predictable electrophysiological effect of the drug acts as the key.
Let's break down the mechanics. How does an SSRI alter the ground state?
By increasing synaptic serotonin, the drug modulates serotonergic projections from the Raphi nuclei to the cortex and the thalamus.
In a normal, healthy brain, what does that look like?
This specific pharmacological action reliably decreases alpha activity and increases theta activity. That shift, decrease alpha, increase theta, is the shape of the key.
Now, you analyze the OCD patient's baseline qEEG log.
If the patient's specific biotype of OCD is characterized by a pathological excess of alpha activity, they are highly likely to be a strong clinical responder.
Because the SSRI's natural tendency to decrease alpha will counteract the patient's baseline abnormality.
Exactly, pushing their brain back toward a healthy, homeostatic ground state. The key perfectly fits the lock.
But consider the alternative cluster. What if the patient's baseline qEEG already demonstrates an excess of theta activity?
If their brain is already suffering from excess theta, and you administer an SSRI that biologically drives theta even higher, you are actively pushing their neuroelectrical matrix further away from homeostasis.
The data strongly predicts that this patient will be a non-responder.
Furthermore, they may experience worsening agitation or side effects. Utilizing the key lock principle, a psychiatrist can predict this outcome before a single pill is ingested.
Sparing the patient weeks of ineffective treatment and directing the clinician toward an alternative pharmacological class. We are evolving from educated, syndromal guesswork toward targeted, biologically verified medicine.
But our sources also highlight that pharmacology is not the only avenue for therapeutic correction.
We must also discuss the role of neurofeedback, or NFB, where the qEEG is not just diagnostic, but the treatment itself.
Neurofeedback leverages the principles of operant conditioning combined with neuroplasticity. By providing the patient with real-time visual or auditory feedback driven by their own qEEG data, they can be trained to consciously modulate their brainwaves.
It seems almost too futuristic, but the empirical data is substantial.
Meta-analyses robustly support neurofeedback as a viable intervention, particularly for ADHD. Through sustained training protocols, patients learn to upregulate beta activity and suppress excess theta.
And does it last?
Long-term studies show that the clinical symptom improvements and the stabilization of the electrical ground state are often sustained for at least 6 months post-treatment, long after the active feedback sessions have ended.
The applications extend far beyond attention disorders. The textbook mentions that by using the real-time source localization tools we discussed earlier, like Sloretta, clinicians can target deep cortical structures.
They have successfully used neurofeedback targeting the anterior cingulate cortex to significantly reduce the perception of intractable chronic pain.
And beyond pathology, neurofeedback is utilized for peak performance enhancement. A fascinating study detailed in the sources involved training professional musicians.
The researchers trained the musicians to consciously alter their alpha-theta ratio, effectively teaching them to induce a highly specific meditative state of deep relaxation prior to performance.
The result was not just a subjective feeling of calm. Blinded expert assessors rated their subsequent musical performances as measurably superior in terms of musicality, technical fluidity, and communicative ability.
It serves as a profound reminder of the brain's intrinsic plasticity. When you visualize the hidden electrical matrix and provide the brain with the precise mathematical feedback of its own state, the nervous system has an incredible capacity to learn, adapt, and regulate itself back toward an optimal homeostatic rhythm.
We have covered an immense expanse of neurobiological territory today. We've traced the evolution of electrophysiology from Hansberger's visually inspected analog squiggles to the mathematically intense millisecond by millisecond 3D functional mapping of neurometrics and the inverse solution.
To synthesize the core lessons of this chapter, clinicians should integrate 3 fundamental takeaways.
Let's hear them.
First, qEEG provides an objective metric of functional neurobiology by mathematically quantifying the brain's electrical activity against a highly stable, age-regressed, normative ground state.
Right.
Second, through the computation of coherence and source localization, it transcends the mere observation of localized waves, allowing us to analyze complex neural network organization and the widespread binding processes that generate consciousness.
And the third,
and most clinically vital, qEEG unveils the immense pathophysiological heterogeneity masked by homogeneous DSM diagnoses, granting us the prognostic ability to predict treatment responses and individualize psychiatric care.
To solidify these complex mental models for you listening, we will conclude with a rigorous rapid-fire quiz. I will present a single best answer style question directly derived from the textbook material. I encourage you to hit pause and mentally commit to an answer before the expert provides the biological rationale. Let us begin. Question 1. What specific mathematical and statistical transformation is required to convert an individual's raw qEEG power spectrum into a reliable, objective metric capable of identifying pathological deviations across distinct populations? Take a second to think.
The required transformation is the application of age regression equations combined with z-score standardization. Because the brain's homeostatic electrical ground state naturally evolves with age regression provides the exact expected developmental baseline. The z-score then quantifies the patient's data as standard deviations away from this genetically based normative database, allowing nonlinear biological variables to be analyzed using Gaussian statistics.
Question 2. Which mathematical concept and its associated algorithms allows qEEG to resolve the physics of the inverse problem, thereby generating 3D tomographic images of deep brain activity without requiring a patient-specific MRI scan? Pause and lock in your answer.
The mechanism is low-resolution source localization, specifically algorithms like Ferretta and Slaretta. These tools solve the inverse problem by applying strict anatomical constraints, such as limiting potential electrical sources exclusively to gray matter and calculating the smoothest, most probable 3D internal distribution of the surface scalp potentials. These calculated sources are then registered onto a standardized, probabilistic MRI brain atlas.
Question 3. During the continuous qEEG monitoring of a patient undergoing general anesthesia, which specific electrophysiological feature is the most invariant, highly predictive marker of the exact moment of the loss of consciousness? Think it over.
The single most invariant marker is a catastrophic, sharp drop in gamma coherence between the prefrontal and posterior cortical regions. This drop biologically signifies the uncoupling of anterior executive networks from posterior sensory networks, fundamentally disrupting the global thalamocortical binding process required for conscious perception.
Question 4. A 7-year-old patient presents to a memory clinic with subjective complaints of cognitive decline. However, exhaustive neuropsychological testing yields completely normal results. According to longitudinal studies, what specific qEEG finding at this preclinical baseline stage is highly predictive of a future conversion to Alzheimer's disease? Take a moment.
The predictive finding is the presence of excessive theta activity, often accompanied by a decreased mean frequency of the total spectrum, specifically localized to the temporoparietal cortex and the hippocampus. This functional dysregulation, reflecting the strain on failing cholinergic projections, significantly precedes the structural atrophy visible on imaging and the overt failure on cognitive exams.
Question 5. According to the key lock principle utilized in pharmaco-EEG, if a patient diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder exhibits a baseline qEEG profile characterized by an excess of theta activity, how are they statistically most likely to respond to a trial of an SSRI, and what is the biological rationale? Pause to consider.
The patient is highly likely to be a non-responder and may potentially experience worsening side effects. The biological rationale is that SSRIs predictably alter the ground state by decreasing alpha and increasing theta activity. Administering an SSRI to a patient whose neurometric lock already features excessive theta will drive their electrophysiological state further away from homeostasis, exacerbating the underlying dysfunction.
And our final question, question 6. In comprehensive qEEG studies of patients diagnosed with schizophrenia, severe and widespread hypocoherence across both short and long neural pathways is a consistent finding. This specific electrical abnormality provides strong biological support for which clinical manifestation of the illness. Lock in your final answer.
Widespread hypocoherence biologically supports the disconnection hypothesis of schizophrenia. It represents the failure to temporally integrate or bind neural activity across distributed functional networks. This electrophysiological fragmentation directly mirrors the fragmented perception, disorganized thought processes, and reality distortion characteristic of the psychotic state.
Excellent. As we wrap up this deep dive into the electrophysiology of the mind, I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative concept to ponder on your own. We have established today that consciousness, coherent thought, and our very perception of a unified reality are essentially temporary, highly synchronized deviations from a rigid, genetically dictated, homeostatic ground state. If our entire sense of self, memory, and subjective experience is ultimately a fragile, mathematical fluctuation in an otherwise quiet electrical matrix, what does it genuinely mean for our concept of free will and personal identity when a targeted pharmacological agent or a localized burst of neurofeedback can be deployed to systematically and forcibly rewrite that matrix? It is something to seriously consider the next time you write a prescription that alters the rhythm of the human brain. Until next time. Here are the details of this episode.
Principles and applications of quantitative electroencephalography in psychiatry. Byline. The brain is always speaking. Quantitative EEG helps us hear its hidden rhythms. Episode description. This chapter explores quantitative electroencephalography, qEEG, a powerful technique that transforms the brain's electrical activity into measurable patterns that can be analyzed, compared, and interpreted. While conventional EEG allows clinicians to observe brainwave activity, qEEG extends this capability by applying advanced computational methods to reveal underlying neural dynamics. Every thought, emotion, sensation, and behavior emerges from coordinated electrical activity across vast neural networks. qEEG seeks to quantify these patterns, identifying rhythms, connectivity, synchronization, and deviations from expected functioning. Rather than examining individual brainwaves alone, it studies how entire systems communicate and organize themselves over time. The chapter introduces the fundamental principles of EEG recording, including frequency bands such as delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma activity. These rhythms reflect different states of brain function, ranging from deep sleep and relaxation to attention, cognition, and complex information processing. A central theme is the distinction between observation and interpretation. Abnormal electrical patterns do not automatically indicate psychiatric illness, nor does a normal qEEG exclude significant psychopathology. The challenge lies in understanding how brain activity relates to cognition, behavior, symptoms, and clinical outcomes. The chapter also examines the applications of qEEG in psychiatry, including research into attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, cognitive impairment, and treatment monitoring. It highlights both the promise and limitations of the technology, emphasizing the importance of integrating qEEG findings with broader clinical assessment. Ultimately, PEG represents an attempt to visualize the dynamic language of the brain. It offers a glimpse into patterns that are otherwise invisible, revealing how neural systems organize themselves in health and disease. Key takeaways. qEEG quantifies and analyzes the brain's electrical activity. A brain function is reflected through rhythmic patterns across multiple frequency bands. A qEEG examines connectivity, synchronization, and neural network organization. Electrical patterns must be interpreted within a broader clinical context. AEG contributes to psychiatric research and selected clinical applications. Abnormal findings do not automatically establish psychiatric diagnoses. Neural activity reflects dynamic communication between brain systems. A qEEG provides a window into the functional organization of the living brain.